Yeah, so let me, yeah, that's it. I love this low fee. Let me see if I can stop it.
Jamming out over
Okay.
here.
Okay, so that's it. When you try new things, it's always a bit messy. So I'm looking forward for lots of messiness today. As we are back on streaming webinars after a while. It's been almost 1 year that we're not streaming live webinars, and be a better guest than Ben for starting up again, right? So thank you so much, Ben. Let me introduce you very quickly. Let me see if I can make this work. Yes. Okay. So today we are here with Ben to explore, as I said, the future of platforms through the lens of Wardley Mapping. So Ben, I will give you a moment to introduce yourself personally. Let me just give a little bit of context to our listeners here. First of all, let me spend a moment to remind everybody what's the mission of Boundaryless, why we are here. Really, that's it. So we are here to lower the bar, right, to access and play with future organizing. As our friends know, we do many things, workshops, consulting for companies, trade topics, but essentially our point of view has always been that of mixing up, right, the future of the firm with the future of business models, because we really don't believe that there is much difference between the two, right? So they are so connected. So we work to connect them more together and make it more explicit. So essentially, we help firms to, I would say, connect with markets, right? And we do it, as I said, in two major contexts of work. And one is platform business models and platform design more in general as a practice. And one is organizational transformation, mainly based on ecosystemic organizing. That's our approach. We have two major frameworks that people can use. One is the PDT, that is going to be one of the core focus of today's conversation with Ben. And one is the 3EO toolkit. 3EO, while PDT is about platform thinking, embedding platform design in your design practices and in your products, experimentation frameworks and so on. The 3O is more about transforming your company. So how do you structure your teams? How do you ensure that two teams can collaborate and things like that? Platform Design Toolkit, it's going to be the core of today, most specifically the exploration framework in the Platform Design Toolkit. That is our platform opportunity exploration. To give, reinforce a little bit that everything Boundaryless do is releasing Creative Commons. So all the tools that and the approaches, processes that we're going to discuss here today with Ben, and more in general, whatever we do with Boundaryless, it's always available in Creative Commons on our website. So check it out. So let's go back to today. You know me, most likely. So if you are listening to this webinar, so I won't add much on top of the fact that I'm Boundaryless CEO, one of the people that are, kind of putting this forward since more or less a decade now. Ben, tell us a little bit more about you now.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you, Simone, so much for having me. I think you described me as a global expert in Wardley Mapping. I was joking with my wife earlier that maybe it's more accurate to describe me as a local goofball instead of a global expert, but I will do my best. I really, really enjoy teaching people Wardley Mapping because I think it helps people understand their own experiences and make their experiences understood to others. And there is a lot that you can do when you understand what's going on around you and can make that known to others. I think that's very powerful. I am a former systems administrator, still recovering. I used to think that telling computers what to do was how I was going to live my life for the rest of my life. That was going to be my career. And then I encountered this DevOps movement, this cultural kind of movement. Ended up getting really into the harder part, like the people side of it. So people and technology together, being sort of a very interesting combination, socio-technical systems. And then from there, I kind of got exposed to complexity and then Wardley mapping and all this kind of fun stuff. So I just love playing with neat models. And I think helping other people play with them is a really fun sort of thing. And just one final note, I run learnwardleymapping.com. So if you would like to learn Wardley mapping, if you would like to even get a sense for what it is, please visit us and say hello. All right.
Thank you so much, Ben. I think I always appreciate your the way you insist that Wardley mapping, or in general, this kind of work that we do, you don't have to overthink too much about that. You have to jump into it, play, and the play will generate the insights. So this is a major question major point that I really encourage everybody think about, because especially as we're gonna see today, lots of our essentially our Wardley mapping related work with boundaryless and platforms is complex, essentially, or I should say maybe complicated. So really, you have to play with that. You have to be faithful that by playing with these, you're going to develop your own recipe, and that's essentially what we want to help you do today. So let me give a little bit, before we jump in the Miro board and we try to use at best our hour and a half to deconstruct and possibly reconstruct how so far we have been applying Wardley mapping to platform design. Let me give a bit of context to the listeners, to the people watching. First of all, we have 2 videos on our channel that you can check. One is the release video of our Platform Opportunity Exploration Guide. The Platform Opportunity Exploration Guide was first released in 2018, and after 3 years almost, we updated it fairly thoroughly in April last year. And everything we talk about today is in that guide. So you check it out. There is both an introductory video and a full Ask Me Anything session where we have been jumping into the structured document and the new released canvases. So ensure that you check it out. Then last week, in preparation of this webinar with Ben, also because I wanted to onboard the Ben on the latest development of the framework, I wrote this recap blog post where we essentially give a bit more context to everybody using it. We focus on heuristics and how we have been using these in the last few years and how we teach it at our bootcamps. So just a quick recap. Today we're talking about really kind of deconstructing and reconstructing what we do with the help of Ben. So the objective of today is to see if we started from wrong assumptions, or maybe we can question the assumptions we started with, and to lay out a little bit of directions that we can use in the coming months and years to review the way we use Wardley Maps, the idea of applying visual transformations to our value chain, and so on. So how do we do that so far? As you can see here, there are 2 pictures, one on the left and one on the right. One is the one on the left. It's basically depicting how we at Boundaryless we have been kind of abstracting industrial value chains, and we're talking about consumers that are subject to fairly commoditized proposals, let's say, on the market. So we're starting from the assumption that a consumer in an industrialized market essentially is pushed to consume standardized products, because this helps companies to plan and basically control their generate scale and control their processes, and that this value is produced mainly through a few elements that are proprietary of the organization, such as distribution of the goods and services, purchasing management, warranty, and the overall business process that produces these three elements that are a little bit more customer facing. And we assume that these four elements are pretty much custom built, so each company has a different way to do it. And as I said in the preparation post, this is not general, right? Because if you think about distribution, for example, for fast-moving consumer goods in retail, that distribution channel can be seen as a product, right? Because you have different supermarkets, but pretty much every supermarket has the same products on the shelf. And essentially these four elements here are leveraging suppliers and utilities and components. And normally the assumption here is that suppliers are pretty much commoditized. So normally the assumption here is that in an industrial setting, companies aim to basically control the suppliers, use them to produce the value proposition, but they don't usually show the customer what the supplier is, right? Customers don't see suppliers, right? Normally they are masked by the corporate player. And I see here already Ben is kind of looking forward to challenge some of these assumptions. But let's start at least from the basics, so that everybody has a same starting point in this conversation. And this is a Wardley map of an abstracted, let's say, industrial player, right? As you can see, it's C-shaped, more or less. And what do we do? So in our guide, essentially, there is the description of what we call 6 platform plays. So we decided to use the Wardley map as a way for people to play visually. So ideally, originally, I would say, we were talking about post-its, real post-its that you can move around on a poster. But now, after 2.5 years of COVID, we're talking about digital representations of post-its, so mainly on Miro or mural boards. So the idea is that there are 6 transformations that you can apply to a value chain, and in this way, platformize it. So let's look into that with more details for a second. We're talking about these 6 recurring transformations. One transformation is as you can see, platform play number 1. So moving the consumer, let's say, from a commodity to a custom-built offering. So the idea that through platforms, it's easier to produce a personalized experience for customers, right? Because it's not a bureaucratic process, right? It's more like a self-organizing between consumer and producers. And indeed, the second platform play is exactly the mirroring element, right? You take a producer, as we said, normally producer suppliers are masked. As you can see, there is this diagonal platform play number 2 that brings the suppliers from the bottom of the value chain, from hiding them at the bottom of the value chain. It puts them at the top of the value chain and gives as well to them the possibility to personalize, to develop their own personal value proposition. And so what is the synthesis here, right? Applying platform play number 1 and 2, we essentially enable so-called long tail economics, right? So the idea is that you create this kind of marketplace, right? And indeed, by connecting producers and consumers, you also have to produce to let's say enact this platform play number 3 that is essentially standardizing transactions. And what are we talking about with this? We're talking about what happens normally in marketplaces, where you have 2 parties interacting on top of a standard process. So, for example, booking a room on Airbnb is a standardized way to do business between suppliers and producers. And that's normally platform play number 3. When it comes to platform play number 4, we're normally talking about the creation of essentially a software as a service, or some package of services that platforms tend to offer to producers. So you can think of, for example, how Airbnb gives people all the tools that they need to manage their bookings, or even book a photographer, or managing the way that they allow third parties to manage their own apartments. So set of tools that, or tax filings as well, like, so set of tools that are packaged into a service pack that is given to the producer. And this is what we call platform play number 4. Finally, the last two. One is, again, platform play number 6. I already talked about that. It's essentially going beyond the idea of distributing and instead aggregating into one place, creating a marketplace. So the idea is that platforms go beyond the traditional push distribution, sales, or traditional distribution methods, and create these aggregation strategies so that they pull people in. So that's platform play number 6. And finally, platform play number 5, and that's all. It's about giving players the possibility to leverage on their identity, unique identity, and reputation. That is essentially moving away from a market where everything is standardized into a market where you have a marketplace, everybody can be identified, they are allowed to interact with each other, and thus they have to leverage on their own identity and reputation. So that's the result of this transformation of the value chain. And here there is a typo that I spotted in the preparation, thanks to Ben. The P should be in the place of the C, and the C should be in the place of the P. Sorry about that. But this is to say that essentially you end up with from a C shape, you end up in a Z shape value chain, basically, Wardley map. And normally platforms, according to our understanding, they tend to control most of the things that sit into that diagonal part, right? As you can see on the map on the right, when you read aggregators, these are the pieces that they normally control. So for example, a marketplace platform should, or in general, normally controls the reputation, the identity. You cannot bring, for example, your Airbnb identity if you move to Booking, or the software as a service is not given out as an open source. It's normally something that you can use only if you stay on that platform. Most of them also controls the marketplace, of course, and some of them also control, more thoroughly the transaction. And that's it. So you have a Z shape. The only bit that I can add, and then we can jump into the exploration, is that in the white paper we produced in 2020, we also stressed a bit this framework by studying things such as the evolution of marketplaces. And essentially, we are seeing marketplacing evolving more into a managed perspective. As you can see here, when we speak about managed marketplaces, you don't have a producer on the marketplace, because normally managed marketplaces embed the producers into the production. So they pretty much treat them as an industrial player would do. So think about what happens, for example, with Uber, where you as a driver, you never interact in a marketplace. You are pretty much hired on demand by the platform, essentially. So that's a managed marketplace. And another process that we identified is the horizontal to vertical evolution. So what we are seeing in the market is that this platform marketplace approach is being used much more widely into more niche spaces. So for example, now, once you had marketplaces for ordering food, now you have a marketplace to order pizza or sushi. That's an idea of how verticalization happens into these spaces. You can think of, for example, as well, gig economy platform and the emergence of platforms to hire, a software developer or a specific photographer or whatever, right? So vertical industry. So that should be pretty much everything. So let me remove the slides from here, and maybe before we jump into the Miro, Ben, if you have any preliminary reflections, and then in the meantime, I'm going to prepare the Miro board.
Excellent. Yeah. One of the things that came to mind as I was reading through this in preparation, and also I was reminded as you were reading through it just now, there's a really interesting thing. So my mentor, Jay Bloom, has talked to me a lot about models, and we've kind of explored a lot of like Russ Akoff and things like that. And one of the criticisms that I've encountered when it comes to making models is, well, when you turn things into patterns, when you reduce them into like just a few basic kind of plays that you can do over and over again, you kill the thing, you make it too simple for people, you oversimplify it, and then they don't learn how it really works and all this kind of stuff. There's a lot of criticism there, and what I realized while listening to you is actually like something from the Art of War. For those of you who don't know, Wardley Mapping takes a lot of its inspiration from reading The Art of War. Simon Wardley read quite a few translations of the book, studied it quite a bit. And if you think of warfare not as necessarily fighting, but as politics, then you start to think a little bit of it in a more broad fashion. But there's this interesting kind of quote from this translation, and I'll put a link to the Project Gutenberg version of this in the chat. It says, there are not more than 5 musical notes, yet the combination of these 5 give rise to more melodies than ever can be heard. There are not more than 5 primary colors, yet in combination they produce more hues than can ever be seen. And he goes on to describe not more than 5 cardinal tastes, yet combination of them yield more flavors than can ever be tasted. Sour, acrid, salt, sweet, bitter. And in battle, there are not more than 2 methods of attack, the direct and the indirect. Yet these 2 in combination give rise to an endless series of maneuvers. And that just kind of popped into my head, not because necessarily like the warfare angle of it, but just the sort of Taoist integration version of it. It's like, if you have these patterns, like they're not meant to limit what you can do. They're meant to help you see what can be done. And when you start to understand the mechanics of them, the combinations of them are almost infinite. And so Simone has the 6 platform plays. Like those, like it seems like they're designed to help sensitize you to the dynamics on the Wardley map. And that ties into something I don't have a good word for this, but I've been calling it like sight, or the ability to perceive how things are going or where they're going to. We'll probably get into this a bit later, but it has a lot to do with some of the conditions, consequences framing of things. The short version of which being interventionism versus non-interventionism, roughly. And non-interventionism can work if you can see where things are going, if you can understand how, like the general disposition, the process that is producing the consequences for the situation you're in. And so when I look at these patterns, I'm like, oh, this is helping me see them, and the potential consequences that these individual patterns as processes will create. And that just opened up a whole like new avenue for me. So I felt like that was really useful. But the plays don't limit you. They demonstrate one very strong example of how the dynamics work. And it's the combinations of these plays and the deeper explorations of the underlying dynamics that I think open up like true strategy, if you will, true infinite possibilities. The reason that this stuff is like a decades-long practice to get even remotely good at, and part of the reason why I only think of myself as a beginner in all this. But that was just some of the things that came to mind. And I just noticed Rahul asked in the chat, what are the characteristics of a platform business in a Wardley map? So Simone, maybe that's a good question for you, because I'm not sure I have a great answer. I have some places to go digging, but it seems like since you've been expressing these platform plays as Wardley maps, like what are the characteristics of a platform business? What are they like?
Right. I mean, in general, I think this is something that resonates a lot with me, the idea that, patterns, the risk of oversimplifying, and I agree with you that this is not a recipe, right? This something that we have to convey is that it's not that you play with this and you have it, right? But at the same time, I think our approach has always been premised on the idea that this way of thinking needs to be more widespread, because the things that were pioneering or maybe just edgy a few years ago, 10 years ago when we started, are now really widespread. So everybody should apply these, even to small contexts. You don't need to have, you don't have to be committed to build the next Airbnb. It's just as you build and design everything you do, with this kind of platform patterns in mind. So maybe you can use one of them for your platform strategy because you want to, I don't know, you want to empower suppliers, maybe without building a marketplace, or you want to standardize transactions because they are so edgy and fragmented in the space you are. And this is still platform thinking. That's the point that we always bring up.
It's a kind of literacy. Like you should understand what's happening around you, at the very least, so that you understand what's going to happen to you when
Right.
the platform player is in your midst.
So let me see if I can, let's see if I can project a marble. Yes, so that seems the case. Okay. Okay, so where do we start? So I think a good idea would be to probably start from the original assumption, right? So does the C shape really make sense to you? And in general, how we can challenge a little bit the idea that as we map an existing market, we're going to face something similar to this. If I can add maybe a couple of points here is, I always struggled a bit with the idea that industrial markets are all like that. Also because not all the markets you target with a platform strategy are industrialized. Some of them are fairly, artisanal, for example, right? So in some cases, you have the user, for example, more into, let me block this up. The user is more like on the left, maybe, right? It has a custom experience. Maybe think of, buying some goods that are normally not provided by corporate brands, but by corner shops, right? You're gonna have a personalized experience, but there are other, of course, implications that are different that should be identified in the value chain. So, what are your thoughts on originally mapping the incumbent market, let's say, before applying a platform strategy according to this shape?
Yeah, so a couple things came to mind when I first kind of saw this. I think we might need to make these a little bit larger. So
I'm gonna do that.
Cool.
If you don't...
So while you're doing that, I'll kind of comment on this a little bit. So the C shape makes sense to me now because I thought back to my days as a systems administrator. One of the things we did was we worked with library systems. And one of the things that we had to deal with often was the integrated library system, which is at least at the time, a very underserved market. And you had a few big players. And I think they roughly match this. Like I know this is a generic pattern where you got resources at the bottom, enabling suppliers, enabling business process, enabling warranty, enabling purchasing, enabling distribution, etc., which then finally enables the user need. So there are a couple things that are probably like off on the details, but the dynamic there was some folks wrote some software, and then they would do an enormous amount of negotiation, both around the business transaction of buying the software, buying access to it, and then also setting it up and making it work once at all. And then every like couple years, it was this big question like, wow, we're giving these folks millions of dollars and we're not really happy with what we're getting, but we're sunk into the situation. Like we have already done the one-time setup. We've already done this, that, and the other thing. And so that this feels very right, because from the end user's perspective, they just want to check out library books or whatever, right? And so their need is getting met consistently every single day. But when you look underneath the sort of the maintenance panel of what it takes to actually make that happen, it's like, oh, it's horrible in here. What's going on? Mess upon mess, and just a huge pain. And that brought me to think about the typical alternatives. One thing I notice a lot of times when I'm bringing Wardley Mapping into an organization, it's because we're trying to answer a specific question. And usually that question is insufficiently specific. It's like, should we do X or should we do Y? And the version of that in the integrated library system space was, should we keep with this big vendor that is not serving us well, or should we go open source and use an open source tool that does the equivalent? And of course, like they would go and think about all the work. You have to hire systems administrators. You have to do this, that, and the other thing. You have to build up all this expertise, and that's almost more expensive in some ways. And it's also a big commitment. And like it's your fault if anything goes wrong. And so they were viewing this either or situation. And so then I see the C shape as like the either, not the or. And the thing is, there's so much more possibility here than like this shape lets on. But I think it's an excellent kind of starting point. My biggest question is, what else is in play? In the specific context-specific situation, like obviously this is a generic pattern, but in the context-specific situation, I want to go through every single node and I want to ask, what else does this depend on? What else does this enable? Like, who's depending on it? And I want to like go and follow some of like Simon Wardley's versions of this. I want to go analyze the transactions. I want to go see every transaction that comes in and out of each of these components. I want to understand how well the boundaries are formed around each of these components, or is it very loose and mixed and messy? And then I want to understand the overall disposition of the system and what kind of things, what kind of default features we're going to encounter as a result. And then the idea that comes to mind for me is, I don't know if you've ever seen those GIFs of people kicking out the legs of plastic lawn chairs. And sometimes like nothing happens, but other times the whole chair collapses. Maybe a three-legged chair is probably a better example for that. If you kick out one of those legs, it is going to fall. It is going to fall over. And so I just want to become aware of the ways in which this shape, when we look at all its dependencies, when we really dig into understanding the full disposition, well, where are those chair legs? Which of those things is propping up this false, I would say arguably problematic setup that is underserving the market that it's in?
So essentially, if I get it a little bit, I try to put some notes here, right? So what are so first of all, different archetypes. So you seem to point us to, okay, maybe C shape is one archetype, which resonates with the idea that I was introducing, right? So sometimes you map an artisanal market, which is not industrialized. So maybe a good starting point would be not just to start assuming that you're going to map a C, but maybe you can map a C, an L shape, and this also brings some insights, right? So given the shape of the Wardley map, am I mapping a more artisanal market or more like a industrialized market and so on? So that's also part of a process that can generate insight. So what are the different archetypes? Discovering the different archetypes, and we can also add a bit like industrialized or artisanal or what else? Maybe something else that can come up to our eyes in terms of making up some different archetypes. And another point that you seem to point out is the idea that we should be asking what else behind, besides the archetype, what else? Because, this gives you more context, in terms of mapping what is happening on your reference value chain, your market reference value chain. So what is that the shape doesn't get? Or maybe, so essentially one thing I want to clarify when I think about the work we do, and I don't know if I have something here, but I don't think so. But maybe if people have read our blog post, or maybe I can put it up here quickly to show. Normally, when you do these maps, you don't end up with a simple map like this. You end up rather with a complicated map like this, right? So you're gonna see, of course, differences between, let's say, the ideal map and the actual map. But as you can see here as well, you can see the shape, right? You can see the C shaped, but at the same time, maybe we can see an L shape or another type of shape coming up. So helping figuring out the archetype. And then the last bit, something interesting. What are the legs? The broken legs that as you mentioned, right? So where are your leverage points maybe in transforming this into a platform? So maybe it's not just what I'm thinking about talking with you. Maybe it's not just saying, that's the map, these are the platform plays, just mixing it up. It may be that there is a moment in the middle where you have to see where is that I can anchor maybe my platform play, why I should apply this platform play. And this is something that happens where we do this work. Sometimes, for example, when we apply the platform play number 2, so transforming the producers into a user, essentially putting them on the top of the value chain, we always ask the question, does this supplier want to be visible? So do they want to be users, or maybe they want to optimize themselves to be a commodity, or just a last bit of the value chain. And similarly, when we say, for example, customize the user experience, we ask if the user wants to have a customized user experience. So if the niche experience brings more value. So maybe these are the broken legs, meaning that a broken leg on a market could be a difference between a user expectation for nicheness and the fact that the market is providing instead a very standardized experience. So that's the idea, that maybe we have to contextualize it a little bit more.
Yeah, and that made me think too about the connections, the relationships. Like, are there inappropriate, or rather I would say, if this is the platonic form of a dominant kind of incumbent who is perhaps underserving, but definitely extracting as much value as they would like from what is essentially a captive market, well then, what are the inappropriate relationships for that platonic form that they have allowed to form? And one of those might be, despite basically the way that they fulfill the need, right, is they distribute the value to the users, right? It's the distribution of the thing that finally releases it to those users, right? However, are there ways in which the users are inappropriately seeing into the business process right now? Like, is that a relationship that exists not because the business wants it to exist, but because it must exist in order to deliver that value? One example might be rework. You sent me the wrong thing, and so now I have to learn how to contact the support person and how to engage with them in order to design a solution that will get my needs met. Oftentimes, for example, when I'm calling into like some bureaucracy somewhere, whether it's like a health insurance provider or a bank or whatever, and I'm just trying to get my needs met, I'm modeling in my head how their support process works, who I'm going to need to get escalated to, what kind of procedures they're allowed, like each individual person's allowed to execute, and who do I need to talk to in order to get my needs met. And so I'm in their business process as an end user, and in that platonic form of this dominated market, that's inappropriate for that form, right? And that means that that's another weakness. It's another thing that is sticking out to me. If the users are already exposed to the business process, are they really going to complain if we disintermediate? If we actually like connect people more directly into the suppliers, for example? Are they going to complain about that? No, they're already used to seeing it, for example. Might be one specific case that might occur. So inappropriate relationships is another thing I'd be looking for.
Mm-hmm. So a few bits coming from the chat. So one seems to be fairly resonant with what you said, right? So hidden constraints, or I added the note mentioning bad profits, right? This idea that there is some kind of weakness, as you said, right? So that's also a good starting point to see where you can, basically peg this platform play, where you can attach this platform play. Then there are other questions coming up. Let's try to see a few of them. Paolo says, incumbent mapping, different business incumbents can position themselves in non-C posture. is it possible to typify them? I think this is what we are saying, more or less, right? This idea of typifying archetypes of incumbent markets, sometimes industrial, sometimes, maybe, for example, when we said retail, right? Retail is different from this because distribution is productized and purchasing is productized. So warranty as well is productized, because when you buy something on Amazon, essentially, for example, Amazon is responsible to give you warranty, so that's it. So of course, this would be a different type, all right? So totally, I think Paolo, you are highlighting something that we agree on. So this first insight coming from this discussion is we have to typify incumbent markets so that we also facilitate insights. And Susan said, wouldn't you start where the traditional market is? Yes, that's what we are talking about. Exactly, right? So it's about mapping where the incumbent market you are looking to transform is. The only thing, of course, that to figure out recurring patterns, you have to abstract it, because of course we agree that when you do the map, you will end up with a particular map, the one I shared a few minutes ago, the messy map. But having an archetype may be both a way for you to look back into the map and recognize the archetype, but also a little bit to drive your insights in mapping, right? Because maybe you start the mapping already with an idea of what kind of archetype you are going to find. So this is the point. Ben, anything else that you want to add on this specifically, or we can?
A couple quick responses to the questions too. Like I think the value of creating, so there's the danger of getting lost in the process of trying to typify all of the potential shapes and so on. I'm not pointing those out. So there's an important distinction here. I'm not pointing those out in order to say that this model is insufficient or that it doesn't cover the basis. No, I'm pointing it out because I think it's important for you, as in you people who are going to be looking at the real world circumstances. I think it's important for you to be able to see that there are different shapes. And the reason I think this is important is because these patterns help you know where to look. It's basically a signpost that says there is something that should be roughly here. And so then, because it's like waking up and going, oh, there's a thing called customer warranty that should totally be on my map. Okay, I'm going to go look for the customer warranty in my situation. And then you see how it differs from the pattern. It's like the pattern tells you that there's a thing that should be there, or tends to be there. And then you go try to find it in your situation, and then it's like it's not there. It's supposed to be here. Where is it? And then you go find it, and you find that it's missing, or there's something different about the situation, or it's further to the right, or whatever. And that the pattern sensitizes you to the fact that there are shapes to go look for, but you have to still find them in your specific context. And so, I wouldn't necessarily say there's an enormous value in typifying every single potential shape. Unless it's going to enable more conversations like this, where it enables you to go look for the shapes that are in your unique context. And then one just final comment on the traditional market, like present state versus future state, definitely an important question. I think it's definitely interesting to sort of start with what we can see. And the way we start with what we can see is by starting with what we think ought to be there if things are working the way they're supposed to be, and then finding out how that's not true.
So another prompt that talking to you about this brought up is the idea that as you spot the difference between the archetype and the map, this can also be the prompt for some strategic action. So essentially can lead, for example, to identifying the broken leg. So that's the idea. So before we move into wondering more about how this, let's say, this shape of the market, it's evolving, right? It's also maybe good to see if there is some key element. At the moment we mapped distribution, purchasing, warranty, and business process, suppliers, resources. would it make sense to, if you look into what are the key elements of these archetypes, what could they be? So what are the pieces that instinctively you say, why is not on that picture?
So could you restate the question real quick? I was just realizing that I should be on LinkedIn as well as YouTube. So sorry, I was missing all the LinkedIn folks.
Right. Yeah, me too. But the comments should be visible to us. So
definitely. I also like to type back, and that's the problem. Fair enough.
Let me just remove my shirt because things are getting hot here.
Yeah, that's how you know we're having fun. Is like we're things are heating up over here.
As I was saying, the idea is to, before we move into how these pieces are evolving, right? I was wondering if by looking into this breakdown, right? Of course, this is just an industrial C shape. We said already that there may be more archetypes, but the question is, if you look at these 6 pieces, right? Yeah. The user, the distribution, purchasing, those 7 pieces, the base process, suppliers, and resources. Maybe we should be trying to map something else, or at least we should be expecting something else, some other big missing piece in this picture as a starting point.
Well, I think maybe one thing that I've noticed is that people, so a preformed map, so prefabricated map, if you will, or even these patterns, or any example that I've ever made for Wardley Mapping, it's like, no matter how simple it is, whether it's making tea or trying to get kids out the door, I've done Wardley Mapping examples like that. Or if it's more complicated, like some of the explorations we did, like technological ecosystems and stuff like that. Regardless of what it is, like when you have a prefabricated map like that and you just show it to someone, it's like, too much all at once. Even when I was reading the blog post that you wrote, I was like, wow, this is exactly what I do to people all the time. Where even when it's so simple, like the example that you had with the consumer producer earning money using value, like that whole thing, I was like, oh right, I have to remember that every map is readable one step at a time. And so one line of thinking is, even a simple example like this is complicated for folks, and so it's really helpful to build it up from the basics. Like, let's actually like dig into a context and play, because then people see it constructed progressively. But the other thing I just want to say is, like, no matter how, to all of you on the stream, when you see a Wardley map, one of the things I would like to invite you to do is, like, the overwhelm that happens when you see it for the first time, let that happen. And then put your eyes on the top. And every relationship that you see, basically, I want you to read this whole thing like a sentence. And every relationship that you see, substitute in the word depends on, or you can use needs if you prefer. And so, like, you can always read these maps just like a sentence. So the user depends on the need depends on the distribution depends on purchasing, and just go bit by bit like that. And it'll make any map you ever encounter completely readable, completely something you can pick up and play with. And if you want to try like extra interesting mode, from left to right with the Genesis to commodity spectrum, you can also basically add those in as adjectives. And so every map is readable like a sentence. Like, the user depends on the need, which is in product. And if you like use Simon Wardley's cheat sheets and things like that, you can add in little things like, which means that it's under extreme user demand, people want it. And then you say the next relationship just like that. So every map is readable like a sentence. It just seems like an important diversion real quick to point out, because even I get overwhelmed with maps when I see them for the first time. But yeah, like, do you have any ideas, Simone, about like what kinds of, like what's an interesting platform situation that you think would be worth exploring? Because I think any of these we could dig into, I think.
But you mean for as a test, you mean?
Yeah, if you were thinking about like, instead of using this sort of pattern example, like looking at a real example, we could do it that way. I'm open to however you'd want to like explore that, or if you have a different.
I was thinking to essentially, I was thinking to another little thing that I wanted to ask you quickly.
Yeah.
So when we do this work, right? We normally do this by starting from our platform opportunity framework, right? That doesn't start from the map itself. It doesn't start from the Wardley map. It starts from what we call the ecosystem scan.
Got it.
So what we map the market according to these 3 lines, right? So I'm not going to be long because, of course, to get 100% of what we're saying here on this webinar, people should be familiar with the opportunity exploration guide. But essentially, what is the point of doing this? So you basically end up mapping what is in the market using these maps, these scans. We call it scans, and these scans are just help you to map across 3 layers. We call the top the fragmented, the long tail, so where you map the users interacting. Then you map mediators in the middle, aggregators, mediators, brokers, and so on. And then you map consumable resources and commodities on the bottom, right? And the process essentially suggests that you go and, basically you take what is in the scan, and then you bring it to the Wardley map, right? So you use the scan as a source for the post-its that you're going to put into the Wardley map, right? And this is normally, I guess, a process that people can pass through or even go beyond that. So they can go directly on the Wardley map. But normally it's very much, in our experience, as you face ecosystems, they are very complex. So you have to break them down into arenas, so smaller pieces, and these smaller pieces needs to be scanned according to this practice. And then the pieces you generate, you move it into the Wardley map. Do you have any reflections also on going through an intermediate step for you to enumerate pieces and see the ecosystem first and then choose to abstract into a Wardley map? That's another point that is very tricky for us. Let me explain also why it's tricky, because let's say that you want to do a platform strategy for, let's say, the agriculture space, right? Agriculture is a lot of things. It's getting the planting done. It's about harvesting. It's about trade and so on, right? So normally you end up with many pieces. And on our website, by the way, in our blog, people will find a blog post explaining how we break down ecosystems into arenas and then into smaller pieces. But then the question is always, how many Wardley maps? Should I do a Wardley map for those arenas, or should I do a big one? So I ended up, as you know, in the blog post, I ended up saying, maybe you do one Wardley map for each arena that we characterize as a systemic job. So essentially a job that many entities want to perform. It could be, for example, getting the planting done, right? So you have the farmer, you have the seasonal worker, you have the seed provider, whatever, and they want to get this done. Or it can be that you start from the user. So you look into the user and the user need, and then you collapse all the information you have connected with those users into one Wardley map. So what is also your point of view on this?
Oh, I'm so glad that you took us here, because I'm very excited about this part, which is how many Wardley maps, or how many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop or whatever? And the answer is infinite, which therefore means you need a different metric. And here's the trouble. Bounded rationality, Herbert Simon kind of things here. Like, there's only so much time in the day. There's only so much cognitive ability that we have. There's only so much energy we have. We humans are bounded in, like, we just can't do infinite things. We can't know infinite things. And when we're making maps, we're making models of the known universe, which means we can always go as high level, hand wavy, painting in broad brushes what's happening, or as deep as we want. And we can go so deep that we're like modeling every single atom in the known universe. And if you're a particle physicist, like, maybe that's useful to you, but like, the thing is, like, when do you stop and all that fun stuff? The trick is, it's the wrong question, like how many maps to make, because the answer is potentially infinite. So what I would suggest instead is think of mapping as a process. as a thing that you do ongoingly, continuously, as opposed to something that you do once and then you finish the map and then you're done and you have all the answers, right? It doesn't work that way. And so I'll say the advice that I give people, and then we'll kind of react to the screams that we hear in the chat as a result. But I suggest doing one map per user need as a starting point. And that means that you might have to make 100 maps in order to understand a space well enough to be good. Now, I can hear you screaming. I can feel the suddenly as if thousands of voices cried out. The maps that you make should not be complicated and big and messy. They should be very rapid explorations. And one of the things that I've kind of put together out of Wardley Mapping in order to make that possible is something I call the 5-minute Wardley Map. I teach this in my course, Pragmatic Wardley Mapping. And the 5-minute Wardley Map works like this. You're going to make some lists. You're going to find some relationships between the items on the list. And then you're going to add evolution to that. And those are the 3 steps. That's how you make a 5-minute Wardley Map. And your list can only have like 7 things in it. Like they can't be big. So 1 user, 1 need, and then maybe like 3 to 5 capabilities, which anything that you think exists and is playing an active role, activities, practices, data knowledge, technologies, etc. Any of that kind of stuff could be a capability, I think, in this case. Make that very small list. 1 user, 1 need, 3 to 5 capabilities. Okay, what are the relationships? What depends on what else? Well, if it's a small list, that shouldn't take very long to do, right? The user depends on the need. The need depends on this capability or that capability. And maybe you, shockingly, make an incorrect model that's overly simple, but that gets you started. And then when you get to the point where you've got all your relationships, well, then you add evolution. It's like, okay, how evolved are each of these things? And again, there's only 7 things, so like you're not going to get stuck. And then before you know it, you have a map. And that's taking you like 5 minutes. Then you have a choice, right? You can either move on to the next map. It's like, oh, I explored this very lightly. I understand some things now. I'm going to go explore over here now. Another 5 minutes in this direction, and then another 5 minutes in a different direction with a different user, different need, or maybe the same user and a different need, whatever. You can go explore like that, or you could choose to invest more deeply into that same map. You could say, okay, I've got 7 parts here. There's something burning that I need to go find out in this map, and so I'm going to do another iteration. I'm going to spend another 5 minutes asking each of these parts, what else does this depend on? What's missing? And then you just basically rerun the process. Okay, I've got new parts on my list. Where do they fit into the relationships? What depends on what else? Oh, okay, I see. Actually, the relationships work this way. I'm going to move this over here and so on. And how evolved are they? And so you rerun that 5-minute Wardley Map process again. And then you come out with a slightly more complicated map that is able to tell you slightly more complicated things about the world that you're in. And so this is like an ongoing process. I have no idea how many maps it's going to take. It could be 2, it could be infinite. But viewing it as an ongoing process that you can just do whenever, and it's not going to take you 3 hours, it's going to take you 5 minutes. That sets you up for the next part, which is, I think, the most important part, which is once you have some maps that adequately model the space you're in, well, then you can start asking them questions and you can start exploring more deeply, like all of the doctrine stuff that Simone is putting forward with platformization, and also that Simon Wardley's put forward with all of the tables, right? The doctrine, the climate patterns,
Right.
the leadership gameplays, all that stuff in Simon Wardley's book. Like that's, this gets me on a little bit of a rant. So thanks for your patience with me there. But like, I really just view Wardley mapping as making maps and asking questions. Like, I think that's the process.
Right. So one point that I'm bringing home from this, right, is that so there is a looming question here, which is platforms are not about one user, right? It's a lot of the work we have been doing is about ecosystem-driven design, right? So, for example, our work in the last few months has been also about evolving this idea of jobs to be done to integrate multiple points of view. So that's why we call arenas basically leveraging Rita McGrath definition, but more generally the idea of a systemic outcome, right? A systemic job to be done. So when you say one map per user need, I feel we should be doing one map per each arena, right? It's more like one map for each system subsystem that we identify. And then it's interesting to think, when you map so many pieces, so you have many maps, how do you combine the insights that the map gives you in terms of articulating your product strategy? Because that's essentially what we do with this platform place. When we say, for example, we identify all the products, because essentially, if people have read the preparation blog post, right? So that's what we say, right? We say, look at the map. Once you have done the map, look at what you have in that area, essentially, and you will see pieces of products that are used to execute a certain business process, and it's likely you can group them up into a product, right? So that's a product, I mean a software as a service, for example, on top of which you can develop a marketplace and something like that. So you apply Wardley Maps to the information you gathered on the ecosystem, mainly, for example, based on the ecosystem scans or the arena maps that you have created, because you want to understand what is your product strategy. So, and then you move into, of course, validating your assumptions, prototyping experiences, and so on. But that's what you do. So I think one big insight that I bring home is maybe you start with arenas, you do one map, and then you iterate on those maps. You ask questions to those maps. You try to integrate them, and you keep maps of the value chain of the arenas that you mapped as you develop your product strategy, for example. And then you come back to the map and see how your product strategy is transforming the value chain accordingly. So that's, I think, an interesting point to bring home. So try to keep one map for each systemic outcome that the system is generating, right?
And that's not a hard and fast rule. It's a specific trade-off that I'm making. And the trade-off that I'm making is I have tried for 5.5 years to teach people Wardley mapping. And that means I have had hundreds and hundreds of experiences where I've walked people through the theory and they leave the experience drained, just so tired from having, basically it's a kind of challenging moment because they're both trying to pick up the theory and they're also trying to explore their own situation and make sense of it. And they just leave going, oh, this is so hard. When do I get any benefits? And so the specific trade-off I'm making is I want people to experience the energy of getting through the process quickly, getting to the end, so that then they can ask the questions that Simon Wardley has us ask about doctrine, about climate patterns, about leadership gameplays, and all that fun stuff, in order to then go again. So get the whole benefit and then go again. I actually think for those of people who are kind of more experienced with Wardley mapping, they're not going to do that, right? They're gonna make big messy maps and they're going to be happy and getting all sorts of insights, and they're not going to get they're going to have developed all the heuristics for not getting stuck. They know to not worry about the fiddly placement of something 2 pixels to the left or the 2 pixels to the right. They know to go, I'm just going to put this here. It's probably wrong. I'll come back to it later and fix it. They have that trained, and they've done the reps of being, oh, this model is going to be wrong, and I'm just going to like keep moving, because that's how you avoid getting stuck, is you keep moving. And they then keep getting the benefits. And so my play, or my trade-off here, is that I'm helping people who are otherwise going to get stuck. So I think a map per arena is a great way of, like, I like the language that you're using here around like arenas. I was looking lower. It's like ecosystems break down into a subdivision of arenas. Arenas break down into a subdivision of components, and like that's a 3-tier hierarchy. You could have a 10-tier hierarchy if you're really going deep, for example. But I think this is a really lovely place to start. Is like, well, what's the stable set of components that exists right now that is worth exploring, that is creating a systemic outcome? And I think that's really a good way to slice it.
Right. So let's move into the last bits of the conversation for today. We still have more or less 25 minutes. I would like to pick your brain on another piece, and I think this is going to be just the start of our conversation around this. But somebody asked an interesting question. She said she connected later and asked, what is the point? How do you identify this platform opportunity? Examples of platform and non-platform. So that's essentially this is exactly what we run this process for, right? So we run this process to see if there is an opportunity to, we say, platformize. And what do we mean with platformize? Essentially, we mean as a place where you can transform the value chain according to these recurring patterns, right? And of course, with all the caveats that we discussed, we should be less about patterns, more about archetypes and maybe more variety of patterns. So I'm sure we're going to integrate a lot of insights from these. But a good point that I would like to use as we move into the closing is trying to use a few minutes to see what is happening on the value chain at the moment. So if you look at the trends we are seeing, right? So because the original question is this: we started with this model 10 years ago, right? And 10 years ago, everybody was cheating about Airbnb and Uber, and everybody was talking about let's move on beyond the industrial phase. Let's do asset-light coordination. We do aggregation. We leave the inventory in the ecosystem. Instead of productizing a business process, we just create software, we give it to people, and then people will figure out how to coordinate between each other. We're going to stay asset-light. We're going to make a lot of money just to intermediate transactions and take a take rate out of it. We're going to control the reputation and the identity of the people. And we're going to just intermediate that. Sorry, I have another problem with the map here, which is unlocked. But the point here is how is this picture evolving? So let me take this one because it's going to be more helpful. Just a second. How is this picture evolving? So if we think about the target space, right? Sorry about that. Just a second. Let me see. Of course, when you have to. Okay, now should be fine. Let me take this up. Okay.
I think since the question is especially relevant to the question of if you can't ask where a platform's going before you can define what a platform is, and there's almost a meta map to be making. We can make maps where there's a component playing the role of platform and it has this kind of look, but what are the generic parts of a platform? What does a platform do? One of the reasons I think a Wardley map is a form that can model just about anything that is subject to the pressures of supply and demand competition, which really doesn't leave out much, is that there's an ontological component to it. You almost have to do a philosophical exploration. You're like, what is a platform? What is it? What is it made of? What are its part? What does it mean to be a platform? And what are the parts? What are the relationships? How does it fit into a larger picture? And then I think we can ask how are these parts changing? And that gets really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and one bit that I want to add is that we are assuming that markets are evolving in a certain direction, right? And essentially, when we think about platforms, we talk about firms. So we are talking about what is the optimal shape of the firm according to how the setting of the market and society are evolving, right? So the assumption here was 10 years ago, platforms are more efficient, right? Are better to serve customization, long tails. Airbnb is going to be much better than hotels. That was the assumption, right? And now we are seeing similar assumption with, for example, Web3. That is one of the big trends in the background. So I would say that the Z shape that we see here, it's a bit like a representation of the optimal value chain as we saw it 10 years ago, the marketplace, the take rate, the intermediation, each platform managing the reputation and identity of the players, all closed, no interoperability, and so on. So the question will be, how do we see these new technologies, new possibilities coming up and transforming this target value chain, the transformed value chain, right? So I can think of, for example, Web3 doing things such as, I don't know, making ID open, making reputation open. That's one of the big promises of Web3 that everybody has been talking about for ages now that didn't really materialize so far. Or we can think of, for example, I don't know, marketplaces not being controlled by the aggregator. So, for example, another big trend that people are talking about is this detachment between the protocol and the platform. So, what happens when we have, for example, a certain domain of business being abstracted into a protocol, and then multiple marketplaces may be jumping into the space and connecting people using the same protocol? So these are the questions that I think we should be asking about the target transformed value chain that is optimized for the market we are going to see coming up. So how can we describe it in terms of value chains, in terms of Wardley Maps?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, like there's the same question, like what even is Web3? And I like that you called out like identification and reputation. I think we could like spend a couple minutes like describing what each of those things is, what it does, what transactions come in and come out. And then I think the interesting question is like, how does this sort of thing happen today? Versus what is the alternative proposal that, you know, all the Web3 diehards are saying is going to happen? And like, that's not like, just to be very clear, like it took me like 10 years to adopt Bluetooth. Like I am not a cutting edge like person who takes a lot of risks, because frankly, like the threat of loss is higher. And I think for a lot of people who, you know, don't necessarily like, they're not like filthy rich and they're not like living lives of excess and so on. Like I think for a lot of people, this is the way it kind of shows up. It's like, I don't have the luxury of going and playing with something that dangerous, or that not dangerous in the sense of like killing people, although that's probably like one of the things that, you know, we're all worried about with these kinds of things eventually, like in the future. But like for now, it's just like I don't have the tolerance for that risk, and so I'm going to be behind, but I'm going to be watching. And what I'm going to be watching for is the way things actually end up being, which is going to be different than the way that people are basically proposing that they'll be. Because like it's in the first, like you make a plan and then you take your first step in the direction of that plan, and then the entire like world changes on you because it's different than what you thought it was, and then you have to deal with that. And that is what, you know, all the Web3 folks are going to be encountering now. And I should say, like anything that looks vaguely like gambling, you probably shouldn't do. But there are some very good folks that I know that are doing Web3 things, and I trust to be like making some interesting progress there. Like, so what is their progress like? In which direction is it headed? And with respect to which parts? And I think like decentralized organizations or autonomous organizations are like really interesting. And there's the dismissal of those, which you probably should not dismiss decentralized autonomous organizations as just another like form of company. Like you should probably go study the parts of what DAOs do differently than organizations that in our traditional concept. So really it's like, what is the traditional version of this? What is the equivalent arena, let's say, for the new form? Like what is that going to like literally be composed of? And once you start getting this enough specificity around those parts, arena A looks like this. Say the cryptocurrency, like equivalent of this, like traditional finance has regulation that works in this way, etc. Cryptocurrency sidesteps that in some ways, but then must confront it anew. All the folks having to put crypto on their tax returns are learning that, right? There's a new thing happening there, and the way that it's emerging is like really interesting. So what is the traditional way? what is actually playing out in the proposed alternative, diff those two, compare them, and then it's a completely different question to say, like, well, where are things going? And I want to make a detailed map. I want to break everything down for each of those things in order to see what's happening. But the one thing that we can always do, which I like because it's like a science fiction thing. There's an interesting book called The Punch Escrow by Tal Klein. Science fiction book, really interesting. It was written using Wardley Maps to create like a future world, which is really cool. And the basic trick for this is like take any of your underlying components. Like once you've defined the traditional system, once you've defined the whatever the alternative proposal is, take one of those parts and just like pretend that we're in a world where it's been moved all the way to the right. So imagine a world where ID is all the way to the right. Simone, what changes? What becomes possible? What do people start building that wasn't possible today? And then your imagination starts going. Like, oh, okay. And just like to be very clear, like when we say ID in Web3, what do we mean? What's the definition there?
So let me try maybe to wrap a bit of the things that you mentioned and a few pieces that I can see coming, right? So we're talking about for sure, what do we see now, right? We see this distinction between protocols and platforms. So this has been discussed by Jesse Walden, for example, and also in the, again, I don't want to talk about our blog too much, but we recently released this blog post here that people can check out about Web3 and user-owned networks. And we explain here a little bit of the distinction between the platform layer and the protocol layer. So what are we talking about in Wardley Maps terms? We're talking about essentially the protocol as if you think about the SaaS, for example, the software as a service, let's make it, this is the transformer, the shape of the value chain. So we are talking about a value chain of a platform here, where you have the users connected to the marketplace, the transaction is heavily standardized, the producers are using, and sorry, this is, again, this is wrongly attached. The producers are using the software as a service. They're relying on their reputation and identity and using resources. What are we seeing here is that the software as a service essentially abstracts and the marketplace itself, they abstract the domain of the problem, right? The domain of the platform. So there is a certain domain here, model of the domain, right? What kind of interactions, what kind of processes we run, right? And this is essentially being encapsulated by the protocol as we move forward. So what are we seeing? We are seeing that people are designing protocols that describe the domain, right? And are able to process the transactions. So essentially both the transaction and the domain aspect that is related to both the marketplace and the software as a service is being increasingly encapsulated in a protocol that is made open for everybody to use. And it's attached to tokens that, to some extent, generate a financial upside for people to run the network, run the infrastructure, right? So tokens, in a way, they are proxies to the computing resources, for example, right? And the reputation and the IDs are evolving to become part of, I would say, more general protocols that are not domain specific. So here maybe we can say domain specific protocols, while the identity maybe and the reputation, they are more cross domain, right? So for example, you have protocols such as proof of humanity, right, that are representing univocally the identity of people, right? And reputation protocols, they are also emerging. I must say that the reputation protocol, I'm going to put it in red because so far I never seen something really convincing on that space. We are talking about the abstraction of reputation for ages now, right? I can recall, for example, 10 years ago, there was already Traity, those kind of platforms proposing, we want to encapsulate reputation for all your platforms into one space. But so far it's been proven hard. And the differentiator here, as the domain becomes part of the protocol, seems to be the user experience. So somehow, maybe what we can think about is that the software as a service and the marketplace, the part that is not domain description, so the part that is more about experience, is becoming even more is going even more on the left. So essentially, it's becoming more. We can think of, for example, if platforms share a basic protocol, what's going to be the differentiator there? Then it's going to be the user experience. So, for example, if you have two different products providing you access to, I don't know, share a protocol for loans, what is going to be the platform that wins more customers? It's probably going to be the one that gives you better experience in accessing those underlying layers. And what else? In terms of transactions, we should be asking probably questions related to another key trend that is the embedded finance trend. So we are seeing even more modularization in the transaction space. We are seeing, for example, the possibility to quickly embed, I don't know, for example, a loan into a purchase, right? Or a insurance into a purchase. So it seems that what we are seeing is a little bit of a bifurcation here from one side that is more like improved experience, so differentiating through producing a better experience for users, or maybe other pieces that we should be thinking about are the other rights that are given to the user. So what other rights? So maybe we're talking about governance rights, we're talking about financial upside, right? And another part of the value chain that is instead more consolidating around common ontologies, right? And that's one of the pieces that I see most promising coming up. I see that the evolution of the blockchain and Web3 space is pushing more consolidation from the ontological perspective. And the big question would be, where does this line sit between the experience that is specific of a certain product and the domain description that seems to be evolving towards more commonality, more openness, more standardization, right? Because I believe that standardization is going to be pushed also because we live in a world that needs to be more efficient, right? We have highly inefficient processes. We have to save CO2. We have to save money. We have to make things more resilient. So we need more standardization. Maybe Ben, you can add a few more bits as we close this conversation for today.
Yeah, and Susan just left a comment on the LinkedIn stream. Like, this makes me wonder if starting with defining customer outcomes / impacts would be helpful. And I that's an excellent point, Susan, because like one of minor rant here, like one of my problems with a lot of technology-centered innovation is that it's a solution in search of a problem to solve, and the people doing the solutioning aren't considering the impacts at the level of the people who are actually going to be affected. I mean, one really good example of that is like artificial intelligence algorithms and things like that, and how, like, wow, if you are a Black person who is subject to an artificial intelligence algorithm that is dependent on assumed caucasity in terms of image recognition, like, you are going to be excluded by design, even if that wasn't the intention. And so there are these unintended side effects. And so I think defining the purpose of the of the whole system, and like, yes, you can have your cool technology, but like, how is it going to affect the whole picture? And I think going back to the pushing things to the right version of this, like, if there's a reason reputation is stuck, but let's just assume that the inevitable march of time and people wanting to make money, or people wanting to make the world better, let's say, if we want to be more optimistic, is somebody's going to figure it out, and it's not going to work the way that we think it works. It's going to surprise us, and actually we're probably going to like be upset about it at first. But just imagine that for a moment, reputation gets pushed all the way to the right. It just happens. And so I'm gonna
All right.
put a placeholder there. It goes all the way to the right. And like, let's just assume that ID goes all the way to the right too, and all this fun stuff. Well, how does this whole system change? Where does the boundary between the user experience, like what is the implication of that change? Well, it probably implies that something will be different about that boundary. And here's where you're entering speculation space. We're not trying to predict the future. We're trying to figure out what possibilities have entered the probable or even plausible space. It's like, oh, well, that line might actually shift, or maybe like when it comes to the user experience, like that might become, like we might wake up to the fact that like not all differentiation is valuable, and maybe like people start to have expectations about, you know, how they interface with the world. Like maybe God forbid, like Facebook becomes the way that you connect to universal ID and reputation. And like maybe that's the way that we don't like that, but like it's the way that made the whole user experience possible for us. Like you start to imagine these alternative scenarios, and one, you start getting scared, or two, you start getting excited. But it's not like whether one or the other is going to happen. It's just like what are the places on this map, the specific places where those shifts could occur? Where do you need to be watching? And this gets into like a little bit of the stuff that Jay Bloom and I have worked on around anticipatory awareness. The thing is not to predict the future pattern. The thing is to pay attention to the individual parts as they move. So like, what do you need to be reading in order to scan the ID space, or to scan the reputation space, or to scan how SaaS platforms are changing when reputation moves to the right? What do you need to be watching and reading in order to notice that shift as it happens? And I think you're particularly positioned, Simone, to like notice that stuff and then share it as you see it, and then people will become sensitized to it, and then they won't be surprised, because I think surprise is where things get really messy really fast. So I don't know if that was the right thread to pull, but
that's a great point. I mean, in terms of what these things make possible and what are the implications in terms of what kind of futures do they enable, I think that's a great point. And while I was listening to you, I was thinking also, what are the implications, which is something that we didn't touch. I mean, we just touched briefly when we speak about DAOs and teams, right? You spoke about DAOs. What are the implications of this bifurcation, right? So if we think about the future of markets bifurcating into more common domains and more common IDs and reputation and this kind of common good layers, enabling layers, and on top of it, more specific, differentiated experiences, and I think Barbara was, if I'm not wrong, was asking what makes this differentiation. We have to ask, and I mean, we are making an assumption here that the differentiation is going to be based on user experience, in the rights that you give to the users, the governance, the financial upside. Because, for example, we spoke about tokens here, but only from the perspective of securing a domain-specific network, a domain-specific protocol. But the question that tokens can also be used here to differentiate the user experience, because you can use tokens also in the platform. So maybe you can have a platform that it's based on shared ownership, customer ownership, user ownership. So that's what, for example, Brain Trust is doing without a protocol layer. So what is the point here? The point is that all these differentiation and these market evolutions are calling for probably a different idea of a firm. What is a firm's mission, and how we think about firms across this boundary, maybe, right? So what is it make the future of the firm according to this picture, in terms of mission, in terms of shape, in terms of the need to cross boundaries? So, for example, imagine you have a company, and this company is creating products that have touch different ontological domains, and so you need to be able to participate into different DAOs, maybe because you want to influence how certain protocols evolve to support some of your products. So all these questions are essential to be asked, and are going to be, I mean, probably posing huge challenges to the very idea of what a firm is in the perspective of a market that evolves towards this new new landscape. So I don't want to be much longer, Ben. We're already 1 minute late, so I think we should be aiming to a close.
Can I throw one more thing in there real quick?
Yes.
I think maybe the really interesting thing to notice is that not just when we're thinking about how platforms change, we're not just talking about platform, like the word, the concept. Oh, platforms will be different. Like that's not interesting to describe. What is interesting instead is to say platforms with respect to this part of what a platform does. Platforms with respect to identity, platforms with respect to the way reputation works, platforms with respect to the user experience. We need that sort of meaningful specificity in order to be able to describe how change is happening already, but also how it will happen going forward. So meaningful specificity, I think, is required, and that requires we define what platforms are. And I think the patterns that you're providing give us a really, really good foundation for exploring that more deeply. But everyone will see a different version of this in their domains, right? So everyone here, I would invite you to explore the domain that you're in. How do platform, like what is a platform? What does it look like in your context? Start with what Simone's provided and see how it's different in your context, but from his starting point. And then start to share that thing, like tweet at us, like talk to us about it, because I think it'll be really, really interesting to see the different ways that this shows up in the world. But it's always going to be about with respect to specific parts of what platforms do and what they are. And I see Susan making some book recommendations, a book called Ontological Design. On principle, that on that title, I'm ready to recommend it too, but it makes me curious. I want to go read that. So thank you, Susan. Ontological Design. Okay, and that's all I had to say.
That's it. I mean, I'm totally in line with this. I think the question of domain design and ontologies and shared ontologies and learning how to share an ontology across different projects or players is going to be one of the big points, right, moving forward. Because as I said, the world has been incredibly inefficient so far, and we are pushed to be more efficient from now on, more to agree more and disagree less. There is this idea of out-cooperating the competition from my friend Greg Landua that I believe it's essential to understand, right? It's like we are exporting the idea of open source now into whatever we do. It's much more than software now. We have to agree. We have to participate and collaborate on stuff, at least on the pieces that we can share, while we can differentiate on other layers. So let me get back to the presentation for a moment. Okay. As you can see, I just wanted to, as we move forward, as we close, remind everybody that we have a webinar, a bootcamp coming up in a few weeks. So on June 6th, we're going to start our 4-hour online session bootcamp. Some of the people in the chat I've also been attending some of our boot camps, so I'm thankful for that. But you will have a 20% discount if you use this code W-webinar. So check it out. If you have any question, reach out to me. In the meantime, really, Ben, let me thank you again for the amazing conversation. I think in 1 hour, more or less 1 hour and a half, I managed to get so many ins, and I will work on those, possibly with your help, and we're going to get back to our community at the soonest to share more insights and hopefully provide more value. So thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you so much for having me, Simone. I'm really grateful to be here.
Thank you for your mental models. They're going to be very helpful for us. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop the transmission now.